Warning: the following content may not be suited for younger or sensitive audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Astral's Journal. Entry number 4. It did not take us long to retrieve the crystal. In fact, it was much easier than I had originally thought. Argyle agreed to the terms and handed over the crystal, and now we were one step closer to completing our mission. We quickly retreated to the inn we had established ourselves at before and regrouped to gather our thoughts. We had decided to spend some time shopping around the city to resupply for our next journey, which we found out, much to my annoyance, would be taking us to the Kingdom of Dewshire. I despised this place, as it was a kingdom full of racists. Well, at least the capital city was. I wasn't even allowed to set hoof in the city because of my race, and I had hoped I would never go near it again. There is a bright side to this, though. Here in Nightfall, I have gained the favor of their queen, Theo, and she agreed to lend her support in our cause, which is wonderful. I've finally made some progress. Thankfully, our next destination is a town called Ikora's Tree, which I've heard is much nicer, and as long as we stay away from the capital, we should not be accosted. This is good, as I feel like that we are making great progress, and I'd rather not have it all taken away just because some people wanted to be racist. It will take us a few days to reach the city by cart, but this will give me plenty of time to catch up on my studies. And just when I thought I could get some quiet time, disaster strikes. Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it disaster, as we were riding along the road and saw some strange green puddles ahead of us. They seemed to be potholes in the road filled with some sort of green liquid. And as soon as we got close, they both sprung up into quite large cube shapes. It looked like they seemed to be gelatinous cubes, although they looked and felt a bit strange. They were a lighter shade of green, and actually seemed to have two functioning eyeballs floating in their mass. Everyone in the party, myself included, all attempted to attack these creatures. Though, strangely, all of our attacks only seemed to bounce right off of them. Another removal from being traditional gelatinous cubes. It's almost like whenever struck, they would instantly harden, making it seem like they were solid as steel, making physical attacks completely ineffective. It felt like some sort of non-Newtonian fluid. But thankfully, I did not rely on physical attacks. I quickly casted a frost spell and froze one of them completely solid. Then I looked over to the other to do the same, only to see Idris politely speaking to it. It took me a moment, but I eventually pieced things together. These creatures were not hostile, only curious. However, before I could unfreeze the one I had frozen, Bluma came in with a spell of her own and shattered the ice into many pieces. I instantly felt grief for the gelatin, but then relief when I realized it was just unable to pull itself back together and seemed unharmed. I quickly offered my apologies to the creature, and Idris eventually talked the other one to turning back into a puddle. I quickly scooped up the creature in a jar and handed it over to Idris. And I took the time myself to pick up the shattered pieces of the other gelatinous cube and put it into a separate jar before unfreezing it. Thankfully, it seemed unfazed by the whole situation, though I still felt bad. It surprised me. I had expected this creature to be angry, but it only seemed slightly sad. What did not surprise me, however, is Bluma acting out once again. She had said something along the lines of, "Who cares? It's a monster," which caused Idris to snap at her. Afterwards, she stated that if we were to keep them, she would get to have one of them, and everyone was instantly in agreement that she would not be getting a strange gelatinous mass as a pet. I quickly gave both of the jars to Idris, who put them away for safekeeping. Entry 5. We were back on the road shortly after the small scuffle with the slimes. The tension in the air was so thick not even the strongest of blades could cut it. I had hoped that Bloomer would see reason, but it seems she is still stuck in her ways. It makes me wonder what sort of pain, or lack thereof, she has experienced to make her act out this way. But I doubt she would ever tell me if I asked. She doesn't seem to like me very much. Though she doesn't seem to like anybody very much. She does claim to be friends with Nihilus, but from what I've seen, she constantly ridicules him. I'm not sure if it's for her own entertainment or something deeper she's trying to cover up. Regardless of this, we kept moving with Calypso, trotting along as she always does. It took another 6 hours before we eventually reached the outskirts of Recorder's Tree. Although I had never visited the town myself, if what I've heard is true, it was once a place where a god walked amongst mortals. Though I've only heard very little of the story. It was also the home of an absolutely massive tree. Before any of us could even awe at its beauty, we started to smell a heavy aroma of smoke in the air. The sign of an enormous fire given how far we were from the town itself. We instantly brought the car to a halt when we saw ash pouring from the sky like fresh snow. We began to worry for the people that could live near the tree, but before we could even move any further, a large shadow passed overhead us. Everything seemed to be happening very quickly, so we were extremely caught off guard when a very large creature crashed to the ground in front of us and let out an ear-shattering roar. From what I could tell, it seemed to be quite a large dragon, made entirely out of shadows, with a bright, burning core. As we all readied for battle, I could say only one thing. Oh dear. By the time we had slain the huge beast, the ash had stopped falling, and the smoke had lifted as the fire eventually burned itself out. We panted heavily from the hard-fought battle, though we were not without casualties. Sopes had fallen during the fight and needed immediate medical attention. But before anyone could even attempt to offer their help, we were immediately yelled at by both Idris and Zil, stating that it would only worsen his condition. I would have pried, but they quickly rummaged through Sopes' bags, retrieving a syringe full of a deep crimson liquid, before quickly injecting him with said liquid. He recovered shortly after, but then was quickly berated by both Idris and Zil for his carelessness. As we dusted ourselves off, Sopes admitted to all of us that he could not be healed by conventional or magical means, because of his vampiric nature. Now I was beginning to regret making my apprehensions around vampires known to the party, as I may have inadvertently distanced myself even more from Sopes, without intending to do so. I had made a mental note to apologize to him later, but he seemed like he didn't want to talk, at least not yet. But we couldn't dwell on these things, as we had a far more important mission to complete. We quickly moved into the town proper, and just as we thought we were safe, we began to hear sinister laughter. As we looked around, we noticed the laughter was coming from 3 more of these shadow creatures, though these were much smaller and did not attack us. They seemed content to simply cackle at us as if they were mocking us, or laughing at some sort of inside joke. We tried our best to get away from them, moving quickly towards a large cave. Thankfully, as we entered the cave, they stopped at the mouth of it, though they still did cackle away, not wanting to chase after us for some unknown reason. After a small discussion, we moved deeper into the cave, hoping to find some sort of trace of the crystal we had sought. It did not take us long before we eventually came to an ancient door. It was unclear as to how long it had been there, because the symbols on said door were unrecognizable, except for one of us. It seemed that Soaps could read this ancient writing, despite not knowing how he could do so. And after a while of thinking how to open the door, and trying to explain to Bloomer why trying to blow it up underground was a horrible idea, Soaps tried something we did not expect. He took a small dagger from his side and held his hand over an indentation in the floor. He quickly grabbed the blade and sliced his hand open, letting his own blood drip into the small indentation on the floor. This indentation was shaped similarly to a half sphere, almost like a bowl. When the blood dripped into the bowl, we heard a low hum echo through the chamber, and the door slowly opened sideways. And what we heard sounded like machinery further inside. Upon entering, we discovered a long hallway filled with magical artificial lights that seemed to react to Sopez's presence, despite him having stated he's never seen this place before. We kept walking along through this underground cavern, with Soaps and I taking the lead. Well, Soaps handed me a small journal and asked if I could make any sense of it. Once I had opened it, I noticed that there was one entry in the entire journal, and it was written in a language none of us had ever seen before, but I did recognize the patterns. It was the same as the symbols on the door in the cave, and after a small magical spell, I was able to make sense of the words. And this is what I saw, and this is what I read. I am the last one alive. I am the last to have memory of what we lost, and with them knocking at my door, my memories will mean nothing
if I do not write them somewhere. Our power could never amount to the greater of the eye. Our eye was the center of our community, the source of our protection and our life. We existed because of our eye. With each study of our eye, we learned more and more, but our world and the energy within it, and our society flourished and grew. Our power grew so much we became threats. We suffered from the sins of our foundries, the hubris that fed the cataclysmic collide that destroyed our hope, our eye, the machinations of our forefathers against them. To protect our eye fell to the ears of those who would not betray them, revealing every domino to the wrong side. We lost our eye that day. We lost the one thing that kept us safe and alive for so long. I know they will come for me soon. I'm the last to know of the eye. And now that burden belongs to you. I have no doubt they will come to you, and you now know enough to put you in danger. I wish you luck.
The details of Guardian Astridis are far too complicated to go into depth in this entry. Let us say that she was a powerful mage who lived very long ago. This note put myself on edge, as I was starting to think we might be walking into a trap. But we continued onwards. Well, I decided to create a small cipher for myself so I could study this language and possibly translate if we run into more examples of it. Once I had finished, I had noticed that we had entered a much larger room. It had a rectangular shape with a large pedestal in the center. Floating atop the pedestal was the crystal we were searching for. Before I could congratulate everyone on a job well done, I had heard something strange. It sounded like chalk writing frantically, and before I could even get out a single word, I felt myself being sucked up into a large blue portal that had opened up above me. Once again, I can only utter one phrase. Oh dear. Entry 6. I had not been falling for more than a few seconds before I crashed muzzle first to a hard wooden floor. After groaning in pain for a few minutes, I quickly sat up and checked myself over. Thankfully, my muzzle was not broken, but by the gods was it sore. That might leave a bruise. But before I could even worry about it, out of the corner of my eyes I spotted a golden dragonborn woman staring at me with curiosity and suspicion. She would go on to ask me where Soteria was. Unfortunately, I had never met anyone by that name, so I quickly replied that I did not know before other people started to join the conversation. After a brief explanation, I found that I was currently in a dimension called Dova, on a ship sailing across the ocean. I also met another mage there, by the name of Cade. Coincidentally, he was in the same field of study as I, though his magic was much different than mine. We bonded quickly and began comparing our notes on our adventures up to that point. A few hours later, we had felt the ship rocking slightly, as if something quite large had bumped into it from below. The captain had waited until just now to mention that these waters were the territory of large sea serpents, and it was very possible that one had spotted our ship. But in a move I did not take, he told us to remain calm before diving off of the side and into the water. The ship continued on its course while the rest of the party was gathered. I hadn't met all of them just yet, but I figured pleasantries could wait for the time being. When the beast finally emerged from the water, it stared at us with suspicion and silence. After a few minutes of a small stare down, it spoke in a loud and proud voice. I am Arise, guardian of the hatchery. Tell me what you are doing here before I destroy your ship. I was nearly intimidated by the way he spoke and growled at the end of his sentence when I noticed something. The way he carried himself and the way his eyes moved spoke of a very familiar looking scenario. I also noticed that despite being quite large, the serpent did not appear to be fully grown. I felt a small smile stretch across my face as I watched on and as I was being reminded of my little one back in Blackwater. She was always wanting to be so big and bold, but ended up looking adorable in the process. And I had noticed the same behaviors here. So I began to speak to the serpent, as did other members of the party. We asked him if his parents knew he was here, and if he had gotten permission. Slowly his facade began to crack, and we simply kicked on. I believe the term is gaslighting in the common language. We kept at this for nearly 10 minutes before out of the water behind the serpent came a much larger one. It towered over him, giving him a disapproving stare. After a brief exchange, the smaller one dove back into the water, grumbling to itself. We also learned that this was not its parent, just a guardian for the time being. It quickly apologized to us before we were on our way once again. It took a few more hours before we eventually reached the halfway point to our destination. It was a large island in between two continents called the Emerald Isle. According to the captain, this island is quite untamed and is watched over by a large ancient emerald dragon named Merimir. And it seemed that one of the party members, whose name was Rio, knew him quite well, as his father and Merimir did a lot of business with each other, but they had not seen Merimir in little over a year due to scheduling conflicts. Captain docked the ship near the sand where there was a conveniently placed dock. Although it was weathered and looked as if it was not been kept up, but it served our purposes well enough. I can only hope that this dragon is a friendly one, as Rio says it is. The Emerald Isle was indeed named. It was quite beautiful to see, so untouched by society, but everything was free to grow and prosper as was intended by nature. It made me think of my home, well, my true home, that is. Although it saddens me to think I shall never see it again, I can still look back fond on memories I have of the place. Even if it does cause me to have a bit in my tongue. Regardless of this fact, I walked along with these new friends I had made. Mr. Riley, the unborn wife before, seemed to have spit the prospect of meeting a true dragon. She had a fascination with creatures, having been raised by dragons herself. Rio had decided to take the lead in this endeavor, as he knew Merimir and could introduce us to him. Just as I was about to comment on the island's natural beauty, by two young dragonlings. Much like the serpent, they quickly questioned us on why we were here. And after Rio explained, we learned that these two were actually children of Merimir, and their names were Antia and Andrea, respectively. Apparently, their father had spoken about Rio before, so when he mentioned his name, they quickly accepted us and offered to escort our group to their father. Having no proper guidance, we did not follow the proposition. As we walked, they told us more about the island and how it was full of large lizard creatures, among a few other things. And we were lucky to have not run into any of them. I was thankful, as I was not looking forward to a fight in any capacity, and hoped we could be along in a quick manner as to prevent such a thing from happening. I, on the other hand, could not have been more excited about the fact she was talking to actual dragons. I will not detail everything she asked, as it was very extensive, and this journal only has so many pages. Once we arrived at their father's cave, the two dragons quickly opened said cave. A large boulder that was in front of us rolled away in the tree. I awed at the magic used to create such a thing. It seemed primitive, almost. It still fascinated me to no end, and I started to become ever more excited about meeting this dragon. We were led inside by the two dragonlings, the uneven stone walls of the cave slowly smoothing out until they were even, and the cave started to turn into an underground mansion. We stopped at a large room that resembled a long, wide hall that stretched on for quite a bit of distance. Their father was absent for the time being, so in the time we instructed themselves at home.